Welcome to Climate Courage. My name's Andrea Edwards.
My name's David Coe.
At the far end, as usual, you have me, Richard Busolato, with a slightly sore voice today.
Oh, yeah? What's going on?
Always catch a cold. You know, I'm not a particularly frequent flyer, but I had a trip this week, which I had to go on. And inevitably, you know, you catch a cold. It's like tick box exercise. You step on a plane, you come off, sore throat. But there we are. I got plenty of tea to keep me company today. So
perfect.
Well, I live in the air-conditioned nation, and I find it constantly irritating. But yeah, you can't not have air conditioning. All right, so we are going to talk about climate populism today, and I'm interested to know. So I came across our guest on a podcast called Wicked Problems, and I was like, oh, wow, he's really talking to me. And then I found him on LinkedIn, followed him, and have been tracking him ever since. So he's definitely speaking to me. How did you guys come across him?
I think it might have been through you saying you found this great guy, and then we kind of followed up a little bit on LinkedIn and stuff, and then we just reached out, and it's a great guy.
Yeah. So this great guy is Joseph Gelfer. So we're going to bring him onto the stage. Welcome. And you're in the UK. So sorry, I'm the only one representing Asia out here. But yeah, so a sustainability strategist and green jobs advocate, but also for me, someone who's out there really speaking at the level that we should all be speaking at today about where we are in the world. So welcome. And do you want to give everyone a bit of a better description of what you do and what you care about?
Absolutely. Well, the sustainability and green jobs advocate almost sounded a little bit there as if it was a separate stream to the climate populism, but of course it's very much exactly the same thing. You know, they're two elements of the same stream. So yeah, I mean, I work in kind of mainstream corporate sustainability, which is, you know, very important, but if we're going to be intellectually honest, limited use. And one of the things that really interested me is like, okay, how can I combine my current corporate sustainability interests with my historical interests, which are more kind of traditionally leftist, my ambitions, which are not reformist and not about small incremental change, rather massive, mind-blowing, revolutionary change. How can I start bringing these things together after a very honest assessment of, you know, the theories of change in the sustainability scene, which are pretty much useless. And that's what brought me to climate populism, which we're going to be talking about today.
Nice one. All right. Yeah, it's
summed up.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that big picture perspective that got me for sure. All right. So what we usually do is, we're going to do this week because Joseph's got a couple of hours, is we're going to start with the news, and I'm going to hand it over to David because you want to talk about Amazon's carbon credits sort of new program and what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the week, Amazon, this is the Amazon, not the jungle Amazon, as in the former bookshop, and now kind of virtual computing giant. The two sides to this, but the basic thing is there's this report that came out about how it's getting all its retailers, you know, the people who sell on Amazon and stuff, and all of its people in supply chain and stuff, to buy carbon credit from it, basically. And he has joined up with this company called 1.5. Sounds brilliant, 1.5. You dig a little bit into this and you realize this is part of this kind of climate oligarch, in some sense, that's growing along, that's in a sense dominating and actually making things worse. So 1.5 is wholly owned by Occidental Petroleum, so this oil company. And when you buy carbon credits from it, what it does is it gets carbon credit by direct air capture. Leave out all the parts about whether the energetics actually work for direct capture, air capture, and all those things that people argue about, but take the consequence of what happens to your money when you do that. So you go and you buy your carbon credit, and Occidental actually, or 1.5 goes and captures it, but 1.5 then sells it to Occidental, the carbon, basically. So Occidental gets it for free, essentially. And under a US tax credit for carbon, 45Q, it gets paid for doing that. And it gets paid if it uses it to enhance oil recovery. gets paid quite a lot, anything from like $16 to $100, depending on whether you employ people in doing so at kind of good wages, as it were. So it essentially gets paid to go and recover oil back out. Then, being the geek that I am, I did some kind of researching and calculations and stuff, and it turns out that you can actually extract like 3 barrels of oil, 2 to 3 barrels of oil out of 1 ton of carbon, which ends up emitting, when you burn it, about 1.5. And you think, that's kind of interesting. That's terrible, because you're actually emitting more out than you're actually capturing. So the carbon numbers don't work. But then this other piece of news caught me, which is quite terrifying. This natural gas hub in Waha in Texas, which has pipelines over to the west coast of America that then gets shipped out to Asia, essentially, liquefied, and they're building up more terminals in the west coast of America. Actually, it's in Mexico. That's where those terminals are. So if you think of Texas going to the west, you get into Mexico. From Mexico, you cross the Pacific, you get into all the developing kind of economies in Asia, in those parts of the world. And this hub in Waha, the price for natural gas has got negative again. So I thought, it's negative. That's not good. Except that actually it was like negative 49 times last year. And that basically means you can't give it away. If you work out the price for an energy equivalent of a barrel of oil, you get given $40 to take the stuff off their hands. Now, if it needs to go down that far to be able to see if you can get someone in, it means that most of it, what you're going to do, you're going to pump it out. Because the natural gas is not the product, it's the byproduct of the oil extraction. So this stuff is the stuff they don't want. They're going to make money from the oil that they sell for a positive price where someone pay them for it. This stuff is just chucked out. When you look at the amount that's given out, and this is methane. Natural gas is methane. Methane.
I was going to say, how do you chuck the gas out? You just release it.
You release it.
Just release it. You open the valve, it goes into the atmosphere. And methane, on a 10-year basis, is about 100 times worse than carbon dioxide. So over the next decade, it's about 100 times worse. So it turns out that for 1 ton of carbon dioxide, not only are you going to get the oil, you are likely to go and give out about equivalent of 19 tons of carbon dioxide for the warming potential. And that's just going to be dumped because you can't pay people to take it at the moment. And if you could pay people to take it, they will burn it, and then eventually it'll turn into carbon dioxide, which is still a whole chunk worse than what you started off with. So if you're going to buy carbon credit with Amazon, with all of its supply chains and people, they're going to say 1.5, brilliant, that's our aim. Buy it from here. You are going to massively accelerate this going on. Then on the other side, the real kind of climate oligarchs, right? What would have stopped this is the Environmental Protection Agency, which is being gutted so that there will be no checks on whether any of this release is going on. So it's all going to go out there. And what's going to happen, almost certainly, is that you will have massive acceleration, not simply because you think, the carbon footprints and things aren't coming down, but actually everything you do makes it worse and it's all going to be let go. It's just like, finally you can be fat as Jabba the Hutt and, you can just carry on in that way and splurge. And that's basically what's going on. But it's all done in this very cleverly crafted, we are conscientious businesses.
And you just wonder about, how the hell can the average person make head nor tail of all of this sort of stuff, right? I mean, you sent 2 pieces of content. I've just shared one. The other one's behind a paywall so deep you can't find it anywhere. And you just think of the average person who's trying to work out what they can do and how they can contribute. Hear stories like this, and I'm sure people who are the business partners, customers of Amazon, they're like, "Oh, this is a great opportunity for me."
And
why would they think otherwise, right?
Behind a paywall, because it's an energy consultancy business. That makes money from the oil and gas industry in that way. these are kind of the inside trade secrets in some sense, if you like.
Yeah. So I want to move on to another one, which, I found this could go both ways, right? So it's a Substack newsletter. Substacks everywhere these days, but Goldman Sachs Biodiversity Fund, the final phase of nature's financial capture. Did you have a chance to have a look at this? Anyone? Right, cool.
Yeah.
All right, so, I mean, this is basically, they're turning nature into finance. So as I was reading it, I was just really keen to get your feedback on it, because, like, when you look at, if they buy an the Amazon rainforest, right? They own it.
Yeah.
Then what? What does that mean within the context?
This is really, I mean, so a little bit of history. So climate finance has basically called on businesses to say you got to be more involved with it, and the banks have been looking for a way to get involved. What do banks do? They intermediate. They basically says who's got money, who's got resources, who needs them, and we act as the middleman, and we take a slice of whatever that money, that exchange is worth. So that's what they do. And within the green kind of environment, there's been a awareness to say, actually, you can't just simply go on and repair the damage. Somehow you got to stop doing the damage in some sense in that way. So these led to these sort of nature credits, effectively. Just, kind of preserve it. We will somehow get money involved in it, and we'll preserve it in that sense. So that's kind of how it starts. So if I'm developing, say, a major project, and I think, a lot of major infrastructure projects are Asian. So let's imagine that I'm building some big trip, or indeed, where's that 4-kilometer tunnel they're going to build under the sea? I've forgotten now. But anyway, say you're building one of those. Then you're going to have to borrow money. And then what they say is you can borrow it in this sort of nature collateralized bond. You borrow, you issue the money, someone lends you the money. As part of that, part of your payment goes into preserving, say, part of an Indonesian rainforest or the Amazon rainforest or something. So that's kind of in principle how it works. Now, that's not itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It does beg this question, two questions. The first question is, if nothing is done to stop the environment, the climate situation getting worse, your forest you're going to try and preserve is going to get attacked by migrating insects that have come from somewhere else, and new diseases that are cropped up and spread over, or simply because there's just too much or too little water, and or whatever as that may go on. So you're basically always going to be on the back foot trying to catch up with it. And all of this, what it does is encourages more things to be done. So these bonds themselves, by themselves, don't really do that. The second part is this problem. Someone owns this, and as the world's productive capacity reduces, because that's what climate change does, it makes it the planet less able to support the modern economy. As that reduces, at some point, someone's going to start asking, what am I going to do with all these resources in that way? And the way I'd like to think of this is, supposing I'm really well-meaning and my wife and I don't get on and we divorce, and she gets half of the rainforest. Well, she might then go along and say, great, I'm going to sell this. So you have this ownership problem. At the end of the day, if it isn't made to belong back to nature, then you end up with it essentially as private property. And as private property, you're hoping that you don't actually get. You're hoping that whoever owns it is always going to be okay. It's always going to be good.
Right.
Eventually, it won't. So that's kind of a failure in these structures. There are two main failures. The immediate one, which is you're still not stopping the climate from getting worse. In fact, you're accelerating it. And there's no limit to how far it will go. And the second one is eventually, as money gets scarce and resources get scarce, people are going to look at it as a resource, as long as it's not owned effectively by nature, which then goes in this problem. Our world today does not have nature as a independent and proper person. It is always a resource that only has value when it's ultimately exploited. And that's a problem. It's not.
So they make 3 points, right? So about, they call it the great financial enclosure. So this is owning the global commons. Commons, we think of commons in our own societies, common areas like parks, playgrounds, that sort of thing, right? So the great global commons is the air, the land, everything you see. So phase 1 is complete, and that's carbon markets, which we were just talking about, the commodification of atmospheric commons, turning pollution rights into tradable assets. And I'm just not a believer in it, because we're at the point where carbon credits aren't moving us forward, right? So that's my personal belief. Phase 2, water privatization, advanced stage, the quiet accumulation of water rights and infrastructure globally. We're seeing that. And then now this is about phase 3, biodiversity financialization, which is currently commencing, the conversion of living systems into debt instruments and financial derivatives. And it was those words, debt instruments and financial derivatives, that I kind of went, whoa, what does that mean? Because
I think to be honest, on taking that side, this is what we've always been doing, right, for a very long time, as it were. I think it may be a great point to move over into what does a populist sort of sense, because what you're saying is there's a degree of indignance about these things happening in that way, and the fact is, not all of those 3 things, or none of those 3 things, work, because at the heart of that economics, at the root of that economics, is that nature has to be used. So it's like saying a painting is only good if you scrape the paint off so that you can actually kind of repaint on top or something. So you go to the Mona Lisa and you think, the only use of Mona Lisa is to scrape the paint off, as opposed to that it's actually more valuable intact so they can inspire.
Yeah.
And that's the way in which we treat nature and we look at nature. And because the economics in carbon credit is that you emit and therefore you can use the credits. If your activity is profitable with carbon credit, then you will emit more. And the consequences of you doing that is that there will be other people who will emit. And it carries on in that way. So carbon credit fundamentally doesn't get it right, or fundamentally gets it wrong, because the economics is based on emission. You can't stop emission by an economics that's based on emission.
But it is getting money to the poorer countries that need the money to transform too, right?
That's because we are thinking not imaginatively enough.
Yeah.
So you can with us. So we love to reach someone in Greenland to talk about this, and if anyone knows someone in Greenland, please do. So you take Norges Bank, which is one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. It's in Norway. The Norges belongs to Norway. It's funded itself by digging the oil and gas out of the North Sea and selling it. And then with the money, it's then go on and invest it, and it's become the world's biggest sovereign wealth fund. Greenland has one of the largest reserves of oil and gas in the world. It's decided in 21 not to dig it out. What it can do is actually go along and say to people right across the world and says, we'll be joint partners with you in these projects. You come and buy the oil and gas that's in the ground while they're in the ground without digging it out. That's our contribution to your investment. And we become joint partners in an investment so that we can actually invest in things. We'll be very selective. We invest in things that won't need the oil and gas, the ways of lives that we can have as a modern society that can do that. This is entirely no different to what Norges Bank did, except Norges Bank dug it out. Norway dug it out and then polluted the whole world with it. Here, Greenland would be inspiring the world in a completely different way of thinking how you use resources without destroying nature. It calls on you to be really imaginative about your innovations and what that means. It's just that we are not imaginative enough. We don't allow ourselves that route, because we're so dominated by this received wisdom that comes from this, Amazon controlling oligarchs that says, nature economy has to be this way, in that way. That's only because it's money that talks. And everybody's going to be running scarce of money. So that it's going to use that to frighten the world into thinking, oh, we've got to keep doing it this way.
Yeah, yeah.
And
because if you don't, the whole system falls over, right? Which it will anyway if we keep going.
Which is a confusion of time. When you get a problem that you cannot solve, you open up a new dimension to a different path so that you can actually have a different path. And this is the part that Greenland would be doing. It would be saying, actually, when you do this, of course, Norway is going to keep digging it out, which is fine because that solves the present time, which is what Andrea is talking about. I need to go and feed my kids. But I need some way to get the investments into the things that are actually about that future that doesn't use it.
Yeah.
So, and this locks it in because you know what? This stuff is sold back to nature. When you go and pay for this, we sell it to nature. Nature mints us a coin. It's like, getting nature's currency. It purifies money. It takes the money that has been created from destroying the planet into a new form, into a new currency that's purified. Why is it purified? Because it explicitly is born from keeping nature intact. Not with any purpose, not with any debt or anything of that kind, but just purely as the inspiration, the source and the birth of inspiration to be able to think of a future. That's the difference. That's what you need to do. And of course, our economy doesn't do that. Our banks don't do that at the moment because they don't dare to be imagining. I was watching this Rogue Heroes SAS thing. I was loving it. I was thinking, who dares win? You know what? That's the thing. You want to get to Germany, you want to get to Berlin. This is during the Second World War. They were in Africa, and they're like, my aim, I want to get to Berlin. I don't care how. I don't care what the orders are, because the orders at the end of the day is about getting to Berlin. That's what I want to do.
All right, I'm going to ask Joseph or Richard to jump in, get some perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to David in the past about the type of stuff that he's talking about, and I think for a layperson, some of it's quite challenging to understand.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be quite honest. I don't intuitively get it. I can understand the broad brushstrokes of it, and I suspect David is correct. I think the challenge here is to find some way of distilling the message, and maybe David feels he's already done it, but for an economic dunce like myself, it doesn't quite land. I think that there's a communications challenge here, which I'm sure when we put some bright minds together, we can fix. But I think it's just a case of getting this message distilled down to the simplest kernel of truth that people can understand intuitively and instantly.
And what it means to me.
Yeah, and then once that happens, I think we'll be able to move forward, because imagination is absolutely correct, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of populism. But people have limited capacity to imagine. So number one, they need permission to imagine, which actually most people are rarely given. But they also need like the infrastructure and the tools to imagine. And we can deliver that. But there's something in there. I don't quite get it, but I'm sure we can get there at some point.
No, Joseph, I'm totally with you. So every couple of weeks, what I usually do is drill these guys to explain what they're thinking more in a way. I always say, you got to be able to talk to my mum, even though my mum's a smart lady. But that's the thing. It's like the best ideas in the world. If my mum can't get it, then we can't sell it. Right. So I totally with you. And I do think it's just two different perspectives, just trying to meet in the middle. And I think we will. I think if we keep doing this, we'll get there. Don't you think, David and Richard?
Absolutely. I think it's somewhat important how you get there, because I think at the end of the day, you will get to the point that David is describing. And in some sense, the analogy with, now I lost the thread, but rewinding, we will get to a certain end point because nature will force us into that pocket. It's much bigger and much stronger than all of us. But what really matters to me as a citizen and individual of the world is that we get there without the dark forces being in control. because otherwise you will get there with an oligarchy that actually controls this, rather than it being a commons that the people of the world can have a say on and decide how to control. But you will get there, but I think it matters hugely which path you take by ending up there. And that worries me a lot.
Can I just ask, does anyone know what that emoji means? I haven't seen that one before.
Oh,
anyone know? We could ask the guys on the Signal chat. They seem to know their emojis.
That's a very Italian expression when you play football.
And
you make a good pass or you make a good move. That's
okay. Yeah, I like the Mona Lisa emoji too.
What Richard's saying, I just want to take one part, and it goes back to this thing, right? So going to promote my book a little bit. Thrive and Imagine's coming out, World Scientific Press. Hopefully it gets in a shop. Maybe not. Who knows? Anyway, but there's this point we make about global commons, and we talk about how it is and how you can look at it. A lot of commons, what should be global commons, are currently owned by private individuals or governments and so on. So governments can't work because we're under governments at the moment. It's just been a complete mess, and the whole climate story and all the rest of it. And there are reasons why, because they need money like everyone else. So the economics is really strong. But what happens if you go down this sort of Goldman Sachs route is that the world gets owned by the wealthy investment money. And the wealthy investment money is interested, at the end of the day, they are under requirements, because most of the money is deployed under some sort of mandate. And all of those mandates essentially fall under the umbrella of saying that you got to generate returns for the ultimate beneficiaries in that way. So everybody along there is obeying orders. And all those orders come from this received wisdom that, if you have money and you need it to retire on, those people need to ensure that they will have the money, and you need to make sure that you can provide for them. That's the whole point of our first part about the unsustainable truth between Richard and I. And that basically means that this money will come to a point where it starts saying, what do we do with the rainforest that we now own? We got to produce the returns. The things that we were hoping would be done is done, and it's still not okay. So now we still got to produce the returns. So what do? We start thinking, which trees can we cut down? Which animals can we go and exploit? What can we do with it? That's the problem when you allow it to be owned by money. If you think about governments, the horrendous story of opening this 13 kilometer road in the Amazon in order to be able to take people quickly to COP30.
That's been disputed, by the way, that as a fact, they were already doing it anyway. So
they were already doing it. But the fact is, why were you opening up this road for 13 kilometers in the Amazon at all?
No, the road is wrong, but it was twisted. But it was twisted.
The plans were started in like 2000, whatever. But the point is, governments have a requirement. They are elected, and this goes into the populism aspect. They are elected to help people's lives get better in that way. And, Rachel Reeves have just given out, or is it Amber, whatever. Anyway, the UK budget along in there. Constantly in there is about jobs and growth. That's the mantra of the government. That's what keeps the oil and the gas and the coal pumping and being dug out and all of those things. So, and governments at the end of the day, if you take what the US is revealing it, at the end of the day, push comes to shove, they are about defending your own territory or invading another people's territory. That's how governments have always been. We have been in this incredible lull since the Second World War with kind of these multilateral organizations. But they're all going to collapse because the US is not going to fund them. And no one else is going to get ahead and fund them because they're all spending their budgets onto defense. They're all increasing the money that they spend on defense. That's going to go from somewhere else as a result. So what you're going to end up finding out is you can't rely on governments either. So what you rely on is actually people. We are in an incredible part of our history today, where people have more power than they ever had, because the economy cannot work without people buying things. So this collective money we all spend is an incredible power. It's the power that every business has to kowtow to. And that's where the marketing story we had the other week, when we were talking about marketing, is so important.
Yeah.
And this is where the genuine voice that can come out and actually say, what do we listen to? It's not good enough for marketers to be working for companies. They need to be working for nature. They need to be able to say, I'm a marketer who works for nature. And the nature I market is that the surface of the planet on which we live has been the richest thing that there has been, because it has allowed its own pace to develop and grow. And nature thrives at an incredible pace. But it has moments where it pauses because, the duckweed on the pond has kind of exploded and the pond is only that size. And it needs time for something else to come along and eat the stuff up. And you can't just keep things going along in the same pace. This is not to say, in those moments, nothing happens. In those moments where you're waiting, imagination happens. That's where you get really imaginative and you start thinking, what can I do? Lock a kid in a room and say, you're grounded. You've done the wrong thing. You're now grounded. Go to your room and sit there for a while. After a while, they get really imaginative. That happens because we're grounded. It doesn't happen because you can just go along and mess about with everything everywhere. That's where you get all the bad imagination. That's not actually imaginative. It's not innovative. You don't look at it and think, wow, that's really clever. Really clever stuff comes out when you're grounded in your room. And then you come in there and you think, gosh, what have you done to this place? It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. We took a computer off our son when he was about 13 for about 6 months because he was doing bad at school. Yeah, it was incredible.
Was there a noticeable pickup?
No, definitely. But there was also I don't really enjoy it when he went back to it. It was like, oh no, I'd rather go and do this. So and obviously there's a lot of attention on kids in bedrooms with technology at the moment. So just one thing to finish off the news bit before we get into climate populism so that we honor our time. And there's plenty of other stories, which I'll put in my weekend reads. And I'm going to highlight all the ones that we have talked about as the ones that we were going to talk about so that you can just go and see them all. But did you all see the Diary of a CEO chat between Gary Stevenson and Darren Priestley? Did you have a chance? It's got a lot of attention.
Yeah, I just heard the news flow. I haven't actually seen what was being said factually.
Well, I would have been interested, right? Because of course we've talked about the whole tax thing before, and Richard, you were really clear a few weeks ago. It was about 4 weeks ago about why we can't tax wealth, and basically that same conversation was happening as part of the Diary of CEO. Yeah. And it was funny because one of the things that Darren was saying was, if you're an entrepreneur in the UK, a millionaire, multimillionaire, and the government increases taxes, you just jump on a plane and you go to Dubai because there's no tax there.
Yeah.
And he's absolutely correct, right? But I'm also sort of sitting there going, so if all the millionaires are saying, oh, it's too much tax, I'm going to get on a plane and leave, what they leave behind is a country that's going to fall apart. And if they're going to Dubai, where it's going to become too hot to live, I mean, the summer times there are just excruciatingly brutal and they're going to get worse unless the change in weather patterns makes it cooler because there's so much more rain there. You never know, right? But by abandoning the country that wants to tax them, they also guarantee that if they want to return to that place because the environment forces them to return to the place will be in a much worse state. So I just think, this idea of just responsibility to your own nations for paying your part so that the country can do what it needs to do to get ready. I think that's an important thing that conversation didn't address, and I'm not hearing it addressed. There's a responsibility. I mean, Gary Stevens talks about it, but I don't know, thoughts?
No, I'm kind of in that camp that you're framing. I think in my sort of economic mind, there is an optimum taxation structure. And we talked about it the other week. I think all income should be taxed at the same level, which put a lot of lawyers out of work, but that's fine by me. But there is like a universal tax rate, which if it's set appropriately, people kind of accept and say, you know what, it's probably fair to pay about 30% in tax. And I'm not sure it's 30, but it's going to be in the ballpark of what people will find an acceptable tax rate. Maybe it's 33, maybe it's 28, who knows? If you come to the conclusion that you are using certain services, and this goes for the vast majority of people, we accept we want services, we just don't like to pay too much for them, and the country decides we're going to optimize tax income, then you will gravitate towards a number in this ballpark. Once you have achieved somewhat this optimum taxation level that people accept without fleeing because they think it's a fair number to pay. I think it's a fair number to pay. I don't think 50% is a fair number to pay. It's too much. And then I see the rationale where people would be leaving. Then it's up to the government to basically form the spending patterns that this tax takes allows you to splurge money on. But we start kind of at the wrong end and say we want all this and the state to provide for all this. And then you find out that the 30 or 32 or 35% is just not enough and people complain. But you need to basically equalize people's expectations of what the state will be able to provide given an optimum tax take that actually benefits the whole. And then move the discussion on to what shall we spend this money on.
All right.
I think,
any other?
you know, one thing that came again out of this week that I did. So a lot of the things that I find are kind of multi-step things, and that's part of kind of, you know, my background, right? You know, I did academic research, I was studying physics, and I then worked into kind of finance and kind of deploy those kind of skills along there and so on. So I tend to look through in multiple steps of saying, well, what happens if you had that? Well, what does that actually mean? And you go on through. So one of those things that came up this week was complete shock to me. If you look at wealth distribution and taxation and all the rest of it, and the whole idea of taxing the rich is because they're this tail. You know, the distribution sort of has poor people, and there might be a lump of poor people who are in poverty, and then it increases. More people with kind of middling wealth, and they kind of support that middle class. And as you go on through, there are fewer and fewer. Those are sort of the aristocratic rich, and they get really rich, but they have this long tail that goes on out there. Mm-hmm. So that's the normal distribution that you have, the usual distribution that you have. Consumer confidence number came out in the US. This is about how good we feel, how good household feels about the ability for them to go around buying things that they need and all the rest of it. And it dropped. It dropped more than people expected, which is what you think. Trump's been sacking people. So, you know, you expect consumer confidence to go down. But the expectation of the future has collapsed even further to the lowest level since 2013 or something. So this is a major drop in expectations. But then the numbers, when you drill into it, what is said is households with income above $125,000 are unaffected. They feel good. So I thought, okay, well, that's the super rich, you know, they go out there and so on. So I looked up what the household distribution looks like, this sort of shape that should look like that. $125, they start picking up. As you go above $125, you got more households with more money. When you go to 150, there are more households at 150 than there are at 125. When you go to 200,000, there are more households earning 200,000 than there are 150, and there are more 150 than they're earning 125. So it peaks up again. You've got this entirely new distribution. That's a new thing. That group makes up 27% of all households.
In the US?
In the US, but it's also going to be replicated around similarly in the UK and other things. With that level of proportion, 27%, you dominate all your elections. If any party has 20% of support, of household support in that way, there's no way anyone else can win. But that's a growing new distribution, and they feel very confident about the future when this side of it, it's the worst level since 2013. They on their side feels great because they listen to what Richard is saying, and they're saying, you know what, then maybe I'll pay 30%, but you can't pay for all the things that they want. They're just going to have to live without it. And what's Trump doing is kicking out all the people at the bottom of that out of the country. So that proportion is actually...
And that's about, what, 72%?
Yeah.
That's sort of in the... So even...
And the 72% you think is okay, but it's split. Yeah. But that proportion up there is going to be very coherent. And they all feel good about their future. That's a complete different thing. It's not the tail. It's a whole new class. It's a whole new distribution.
But that tallies very well with what we've seen around the world, that you've destroyed the middle class.
Yes.
That traditionally was the center of most countries' sort of normal distribution in terms of income. And I think US is probably a bit more extreme than other countries, because I strongly suspect that in that tail is actually not income from jobs that drive that kind of income. It's investment income and Bitcoin income and other things, which all of a sudden makes it a lot less stable. And the policies that we are seeing pursued at the moment probably means it's even less stable than it would have been in a more coherent world. So I think it poses for the US an extreme social challenge when that kind of distribution starts crumbling, because then funky and not necessarily good things happen.
It's the rental income, second.
Yes, second home income, a dividend income,
gas and the income, back and earn the income. It's those sort of additional elements that you have along that allows you to supplement your 30,000 to to your household for 60, 70,000 and push it up to 120 and beyond in that way. It's not
but like Richard said, a lot of that is at risk because of the environment.
Yes, absolutely.
So while they feel certain about the future, for how much longer, right?
Undoubtedly, the world is effed. That's a short of it. And when the world is effed, everybody's effed. But the fact is that their approach towards what's happening in policies and their perspective of what's being done, and even their perspective of the environment and so on, is you can't do everything, which is right. And that's a really important thing. There was a talk, I'll see if I can find the link to it, by Charles Handy from Stanford about carbon capture and so on. And one thing he was making is this point: you can't afford to do everything. Energetically, you can't afford to do everything, not just in terms of money. You have to actually think about what you do. A gerbil running in a little spinning wheel to try and generate electricity is just a stupid thing to try and do in that way. Putting a shield up in space to try and protect it in some form is another stupid thing to do. Thinking about flying to Mars as the way to save humanity is a stupid thing to do. In this point in time, you have to be more understanding about how you can live to the energy supply that is sensible versus how to increase the energy supply, because every attempt to increase energy supply accelerates the pace of climate change, which nobody talks about, but that's the reality. But the fact is, I
was just going to ask Joseph if he wanted to jump in with any thoughts. I don't want him to feel like he can't get a word in.
Well, actually, I might hang this over, because I think, the kind of wealth tax, money redistribution, and the economics behind change for climate populism is a significant part of the discussion. So we might kind of put that sequentially a little bit later, I think.
Yeah. All right.
Perfect.
All I want to say is, someone who's been in the global south, traveled the whole region, practically. When you go to a city, have you guys been to Mumbai?
No.
Yeah. The level of security, these enormous metal bollards that sort of come up, and the security checks just to go into a hotel, right? Gated communities. Even in Singapore, it's always had gated communities, but you don't really need them because it's so safe, right? But walking into a hotel and there's people with machine guns outside of banks, that has been gradually happening in the Northern Hemisphere, especially in the last sort of decade or so. And people have been embracing it because they want to feel safer. But the reality is, they don't want to address the problem that created the need to feel safer. And so what they're allowing is, there's a great, I suppose, a meme going around, and it shows the end of the Iraq War and the militarization of the US police. And it's like when one stopped, the other began. It's not a positive path, and we seem to be willingly jumping on it because people are scared and they want to feel safe. And as climate breakdown continues, I don't think that people are quite appreciating what that means. And that goes back to other conversations we've had about, there's a lot of short-term thinking in the mix. So those people who feel safe with their wealth and optimistic about the future, are they really paying attention? Doesn't sound like it, especially if they're living in somewhere like Florida or Texas or New Orleans, or, so I don't know, it's kind of, there's so much being missed,
I think in their defense, there is this element to say, look, there's nothing I can do. And I'm going at the moment not turn on my heating.
You're just breaking up a lot, David.
And
back. Now he seems to be back.
I'm not using the gas that I might be burning as a result. Okay. Yeah. So there's this sense that there's nothing I can do. So I'm wearing 2 jumpers at the moment. I'm not turning on the heating. So because I want to save on the gas that I have a gas boiler. And instead of paying the money to change to a heat pump, and because I don't necessarily think that's a great thing, or I can't put one in, or whatever reason it is, I can do it simpler by just not burning the gas. But nothing stops that gas from being burnt by someone else. And the way the received wisdom of the economy will work is that it will be burnt by someone else. And that's the part. So in their defense, there is this aspect of saying, if that's the case, I just need to amass as much wealth as I can, so that when the shit hits the fan, that I can actually have a better chance of a better buffer. I'm on a higher ground. I can last there longer. If I'm from there and I'm on higher ground, I might be able to pick my hand out and pull the people I like into me, and actually have a community around, or whatever it is. So I form a gate around it, and I do all those things. That's kind of one element of what's going on. It's not that they don't see it, but they don't really trust the government to deal with it. And they certainly don't believe the businesses will deal with it, because they themselves own a lot of that, and they know what they're doing. They're clever people. They are very aware. It's a very conscious choice. But at the root of that is a sense of saying, what can I do if I can't stop the other people from using what I don't use? If I'm not going to cut the tree in the rainforest, someone else is going to come in along and cut it down. And I'm not going to be able to stop them. So what do I do? And this shared responsibility, this sort of sense of kind of shared recognition that we are in this kind of global situation, is both the sharing of the sense of helplessness, and also the sharing that actually somehow getting together, there is something.
Yeah. You remember we had Robin Hicks on last year to talk about being a journalist in Asia. He just did a podcast where he was interviewing journalists in Asia, talking about the challenge of doing their job. I'll send it to you because you'll be really interested in it. How can you not feel hopeless, right? when you really understand the problems, especially when you go out beyond the wealthy nations into the poorer nations, and you understand how the corruption works, and you sort of sit there and you look at it and you're like, so I think today is the day, or it's very soon, where Thailand will stop receiving waste from the West. Yeah. Right. You've seen photos and videos of me picking up rubbish off the beach, right? But we know that corrupt industry will continue. And we know that the poorest people will be impacted by that waste, and they will be sickened by it. But it doesn't stay there. And that's one of the most ridiculous things about the whole waste industry is there was a time when it stayed there. I think Nature just released a report about the amount of Coca-Cola waste that will be in the ocean is enough to fill the bellies of 18 million whales. It's like, how can people feel hopeful, right? And I think that's a good time to move on to climate populism. And so everyone's talking about climate populism, and I think it's great that we are, but I want to give you the definition of populism, and then I'm going to hand it over to Joseph. So it's a political program or movement that champions or claims to champion the common person, usually by contrast with a real or perceived elite or establishment. Populism usually combines elements of the left and the right, opposing large business and financial interests, but is also frequently hostile to established liberal, socialist, and Labour parties. So that just gives you a definition. And I'm going to hand it over to Joseph to introduce us to the concept of climate populism based on his definition.
All right, cheers. So maybe a quick caveat, right? So this is a conversation, it's a meta conversation about climate populism, right? So it's going to sound quite technical. So I think it's quite important at the start to understand that when climate populism manifests in society, it's going to look different. It's not going to be a political science discussion. It's not going to have the word climate in it. It's not going to have the word populism in it. And it will look quite different. So if you're not kind of feeling the climate populist vibe in this discussion, that's why. And that in itself is an interesting point. So I would actually argue that what that definition misses is the energy, the vibe. It's a particular mode of communication. And this is something which a lot of people discount. I mean, if you look at MAGA, for example, and Trump, that's a vibe. It's almost more of a vibe and energy than it is a coherent ideology. There is ideological elements to it, but it's more energistic than anything else. So let's just get those kind of caveats out there. So in the technical sense, climate populism, what is it? It's a way of addressing the climate and nature crises in a way that prioritizes the economic well-being of ordinary people and mobilizes the tendency to resist the elites in a really basic sense. So I guess if we were, there are many, many elements to it. So if I'm going to start with the two I think most important ones, it is that we need to pay people to decarbonize. So in the climate world, I mean, the concept of just transition has got a lot of momentum, which is great. And this is essentially what it means. But just transition can be can look very different depending on like the qualitative and quantitative nature of it. So in businesses right now, people are really thinking about just transition as, okay, let's just kind of upskill people with some green skills, and then they can play a part in the new green economy, which is essentially just like a slightly greener version of the status quo. So that's a pretty kind of minimal understanding of the just transition. If you were thinking of much more expansively, then you would have just transition as a total reordering of the economy, which actually I think is probably something that's a bit more in line with what David was talking about earlier. But first of all, you're never going to get any type of green transition, whether or not the really kind of limp version or the really energistic version, unless people can afford to do it. If you don't allow them to afford it, you're going to get the yellow vest movement. You're going to get farmers protesting. You're going to get people blowing up cameras because they resist ULEZ in London. That's just not going to happen. So just forget about the moral point of view. Just from a strategic point of view, you're never going to get any type of green transition unless people are economically enabled to do it. So that's point number one. Point number two, and this is where it's very difficult for a lot of climate people, is that this is not a progressive movement. And that really needs to be understood at a very fundamental level. This is a post-left, right binary movement. And here we come into the main problem of when a lot of climate people are talking about climate populism. They think that basically they're going to be able to somehow hoodwink regular folks into believing that what they're talking about is populism because they call it populism. But they're actually just got their same old progressive worldview, right? They've actually got no interest in changing that progressive worldview. They've got no interest in owning all of the catastrophically evil things that they've done to poor people over the past kind of 40 years. They've got no interest in owning why Trump was, won the election. Instead, they just think they're going to fix climate by making people progressive. It's just not going to happen. It's total delusion. So climate populism needs to find a way to genuinely reconcile the different types of political worldview that there are out there. And that means ultimately, I think, you're going to have to accept that you're going to be working with people that you don't like. Maybe there's going to be some bad guys in the mix. Maybe there's going to be some racists in the mix. But then you've got to ask yourself a difficult question. What am I more interested in doing? Is my priority popularizing my political worldview? Or is my priority course correcting climate change? And I think the really uncomfortable truth that we find in the climate movement right now, whether or not they're activists or professionals, is that by and large, the climate movement is more interested in furthering its ideology than it is course correcting climate change. And that's going to have to change. So those are my 2 points: paying people to decarbonize, being post left right. Maybe I'll leave it there. Hand back.
No, so okay, so I'm totally with you, especially the paying people to decarbonize. I think that's absolutely a critical piece, right? So I'm sorry, I forgot to do this. So I'll do this so that no one feels like they're the affording to decarbonize. So I always look at everything through the lens of the global south, where I'm based. So I just wanted to be clear on that. We've had people who work with refugees here in Africa. We've had people from right across the region. When USAID sort of collapsed, what that did was take away a lot of funding, where, say, rather than refugees basically deforesting an entire area, they could turn up and get solar cooking facilities provided by organizations like USAID. And now, as you were talking earlier about the defense industry as well, not just America, the UK is reducing its budget. USAID is also, or it might even be another part, they're reducing or stopping their contributions to Indonesia to progress beyond coal. So one of the bigger challenges that I find with this whole piece is, so first of all, people in the global south are much more connected to the roots of being able to live sustainably, grow their own food, fish, all that sort of stuff, because they're not that far away from it. So on one side, that is true. But on the other side, decarbonizing coal in the region, we know that China can do it and it will continue to do it. India, mate, they're stocking up on their coal right now because they're ready for the next hot season that's going to kill people, right? So we can't just look at our own countries, wealthy countries. We've got to look at how can they support these other countries to move faster, because that benefits everyone. And there seems to be this massive pushback against that. So that's one of my issues with that. So I don't know, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. Look, those are really good points. And again, there are no comfortable discussions around this subject. So I think one of the really important things that we need to do, just as like an aside, is create safe spaces for difficult discussions, and assume that the people that we're talking to are talking in good faith. Give them the benefit of the doubt. So when we hear things that we don't like, we know that it's the sticky part of the conversation, and not because people are bad. I think that's an important little caveat to get out there. So because I think there are some uncomfortable conclusions to my answer here. So we got this tension. On the one hand, we've got the ethics of proximity, right? So people are less bothered about people in the global south, if you're sat in London, than they are people in their own household. Obviously, it's just a given. Then you've got the practicalities of how you administrate these types of financial mechanisms. And the nation state my feeling is the nation state is probably, today at least, the largest administrative unit where you can do interesting things with finance. At least to the point where you can sell it to the people, assuming that you've got to win elections. So that and the fact that people are short term, and they don't really do long term thinking. So that's kind of like one side of the conversation, which is all pretty depressing. Then on the other side of the conversation, you've got what you're talking about, which is absolutely correct. Obviously, the carbon emissions of the global south if you take China out of the equation, are very minimal within an historical context. And the global north has built all of its wealth on its historical emissions, of course. But so what happens? Yes, they need to be paid. I mean, I saw one study that showed that, the carbon debt implied reparations of something like $200 trillion for the global south, which is mind-boggling. So, and it makes absolute sense. Okay, maybe this is just a framing issue. Well, let's not call it reparations to the global south, because no one's ever going to sell reparations to anybody. That's just political death. But we can just describe it as, a global investment in our one climate, right? So there's one atmosphere, one climate, one problem. We are one people. We're not giving the global south anything. We're just investing in our needs. So you could argue that that's like just a framing problem. I still don't think it's going to fly. I mean, you need to do that, and these aren't either or things. But I think there's probably a sequential issue here. I think, first of all, you need to make people feel better about today before they can feel better about tomorrow. People don't even have the mental bandwidth to think about tomorrow if they're trying to survive today. And again, I think this is something that a lot of the climate high-ups and the elites just don't really understand, because most people in the climate scene are very, very comfortable. They just don't get the lived experience of regular people in their own countries, let alone global south. So you've got to make people's lives better today. You've got to look after them. And then I think once they're feeling okay, they might have a bit of bandwidth to start addressing those more global problems. So while I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and ultimately we will all pay for the global south, there's no other way that this is going to happen.
One way or another, right?
Yeah, for sure. Eventually. Sequentially, I think it might need to be a little bit more canny than that. And I think we probably need to focus on our own people, however triggering that might sound. Get them feeling right first. Make sure that we can actually stay in power. And I'd like to talk a little bit later about the implications of what being in power as a climate populist means. And then once we've kind of sorted out our own people, then I think we've got a much better chance politically of addressing this at a global level. And maybe that sequencing, I think, I'm going to say that's like a 15-year process, something like that. But what you're saying is correct, but we can't have it all immediately. You
think we've got 15 years?
I think that's kind of how long it's going to we've got 15 years to what? I mean, if I block out the time about how long I think various things need to take to get them over the line, that's the kind of time frame I've got in mind, unfortunately.
All right, Richard, did you want to add something?
No, I can hold my hand up and say I kind of subscribe totally to the arguments you're making, because that's the reality of how the world really works. I'm not going to be overly concerned with my neighbor if my family is starving, right? First, I'm going to feed my children, then I can see what I can do for my neighbor, and let alone someone in another country far, far away. And I think that is an enormous hurdle to overcome. That, frankly, policymakers in the West are struggling hugely with, to actually get the sense of, unless I feel safe enough and good enough about my own situation, I don't have the space, the bandwidth to care about others. So you need to get to that point first. I haven't processed the 15-year time frame because I'm very bad at political understanding. I think this is how it should be. Why do not people get it? Move on. But given how long everything takes, it seems like 15 years could even be optimistic, I don't think we have anything near that amount of time before we basically start dismantling the social and economic fabric of the wealthy world. And that's going to make it more difficult to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. Can I, Joseph? Sorry, I had a different screen on, so I didn't see all these questions.
I think
6 comments.
Easier to. I mean,
just a sec, David. Can we just quickly? So there's I can't see who this is, but how does the populist movement generate the type of capital needed to pay people to decarbonise on the scale needed?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to that, and maybe answer Richard's point about the timeline as well, because these things kind of go together. So first of all, I think we need to kind of just take a little step back and look at theories of change. So one of the failures on the left that has gone back forever is that people demand change. I live in Hackney in London. There's a poster up on the wall for the We Demand Change meeting with a bunch of people like Jeremy Corbyn and Varoufakis and a bunch of other people that's taking place just down the road tomorrow, in fact.
Wow.
And these guys have been demanding change for their whole lives, right? And, as have most of progressives. And then I was going back to think about the Occupy movement, who demanded change, and we, occupied spaces all around the world. And then people, just waited people out. They just waited for them to go home. You can demand change all you like. It just makes no difference, right? Or nothing substantial. So you've actually got to take power. And this is something which worries people, because, climate populism to me it's not a campaign. It's not even a movement. It is ultimately a political party. It is an electoral drive that needs to take power, because those in power do not do anything useful unless it fits their agenda. So the people in power at the moment are never, let's not beat around the bush, they are never going to do what is necessary to that group of people. So they've got to go. So the only way that you're not going to change their minds, you've got to get rid of them one way or another. So the only way you're going to get rid of them, unless you're going to have an armed coup, which I don't really subscribe to. Well, I don't kind of fetishize democracy. I'm not one of those types either. But I do assume that we've got to win an election, right? So this is where, unfortunately, you get to the time frame. So if we're in the UK, we need to. There's no party to do this. So all right, so you've got to start a political party. You've then got to convince people that you can break the two-party system, which I think Farage is going to do in 2029. He's probably going to win the election or come a very close second, which means that people will understand that the two-party system in the UK is finally over, which is fantastic. That means that your next opportunity is 2034. So 2034, I think, is a reasonable chance to get a climate populist government into the UK. If you were looking in the US, you're going to have somebody who co-opts the Democrats in the same way that Trump co-opted the Republicans, because the system works a little bit different there. But there's no way that you're going to get a climate populist movement up in time to do that. So you need to throw out a leader, and then that leader would then need to be able to overtake the Democrat Party, which is not going to happen by 2028. So that puts you into 2032. So you've either got 2032 or 2032 or 2034 when you're in power. Only then can you actually start implementing changes. That's why I'm kind of thinking 15 years to actually be able to try and sort your own people out and then move over. But the issue of payment, this is pretty wild. Okay, so there's a range of options that you can use here, and I'm kind of agnostic. I'm just kind of like putting the options out to like draw some territory out there. So first of all, the idea of a carbon fee and dividend scheme is pretty commonly accepted as quite sensible. It has limitations. It's never going to pay for what we need to be done, but it's something. So some type of carbon fee and dividend scheme is in the mix. Then we've got quantitative easing, which is in the mix. The last figure I saw in the US, it was something like 7 trillion that was created for COVID. If we can cough up 7 trillion for COVID, we can cough up however much. The other issue here, and I know as economists, you guys will push back on this because I've said it before. If you look at the cost of the global debt market, which is around 300 trillion, if you look at the scale of the notional derivatives market, that's something like 600 or 700. So you've got like $2 quadrillion there. Now that stuff doesn't really exist, I accept. But what it does is it kind of gets you into the mindset of the smoke and mirrors nature of finance at this level, and that we can probably make some shit up. Okay, ultimately, a lot of this stuff is illusionary. If we can do this to ensure the existence of life on Earth, there's nothing left other than that, right? And I think once we've managed to frame this over that 10 years or so, we'll get that kind of stuff over the line. But I don't know the technicalities of those systems. The point being, and here we come back to imagination, or we might have David's thrive economy in the mix. Maybe that's the answer. But we just need to think with imagination, expansively, assume that just because something has not been done before, it does not mean that it can't be done. We've got an historically unprecedented problem. It's going to take an historically unprecedented solution.
I think there are a number of kind of things, right? So the usual thing that happens when people come up with suggestions and comments and stuff is they then start talking about the suggestions as to how, oh, that wouldn't work, or that, or whatever it is. But the bit that I think what Joseph is saying at finish with is really, really significant. This is unprecedented. Every textbook there is about politics, systems, and economics and stuff was written before there was a climate problem to be resolved. Every idea that you start with thinking of, that you put up on your brainstorming wall, came from that. And the point about brainstorming is it's not the first round, it's typically the third round where actually ideas start coming out. So the typical comment is, oh, that won't work. It's not the way of kind of addressing this along. Is to go along and say, okay, the ball's been passed, let's pass it on. Let's go along and think of some other thing. Let's get more stuff up there and bring it all together. Because at the end of the day, what will happen, and it's good to frame this and think about this, what will happen first is modern economy collapses. That increases conflict. Then you see the real physical damages coming along. Now, people don't think of it in that sequence because the scientists have been telling us about how sea levels will rise. But way before sea levels rise is the fact that my coastal property isn't going to sell, because other people buying are anticipating and hearing what it might be. And that reduces the value of the property. That means that my mortgage is now in trouble, and that brings on other things along. The situation in the US at the moment and the fire in Korea is going to be a case of saying, this is going to need more money. Everything will require more money because my roof is leaking, because instead of the cold and warm and stuff and heat coming along every 20 years and I need to repaint it, and I need to do it in 5 years. And I'm not doing it because I can't afford to, so it's going to cave in on me. So it's the economy that comes along, and it'll be the economy that brings down whatever color of government that there is. So given that situation, the populist idea, the populism, the populist as a political force is really important. Because what that populist is that it doesn't have to have a party color. It is about the voice of people who feel that it is better to live on the surface of the planet than not. That's what this is about. It's about whether you enjoy living on the surface of the planet or not. In a life that helps you to think, I'm thriving. I've got things that give me joy. I can celebrate in living on the surface of the planet. And that's what's going to bring people together, because all the conflicts and everything else, it may be 2029, it may be 2032, it may be whatever time it is. But there was this thing, this article about the cost and stuff that Andrea sent. And I threw back this thing that Richard and I did. The dollar in your pocket. How much is climate change going to cost in dollar in your pocket? If you look up the SSR and Social Science Research Network, there's a paper there by the two of us called How Much Will Climate Change Cost the Dollar in Your Pocket? And we did our usual hedge fund stuff. We did an analysis on the basis of sort of what would it cost as a bankruptcy argument. And basically, your pension is worth less than half of what is stated at the moment. That's what it is. So what does that mean for me? It means that if I've got money along, I shouldn't invest in my pension because it's worth less, because I'll be buying it at double the price it should be. That's a stupid thing to do, pay double something. I should be investing it. How? Well, this is where the investment to all the other people, the money for that, decarbonization term, or in our kind of language to invest in that thrive economy would be in that way. It comes from people becoming financially aware that when they put their dollar into their pension, they are buying it at twice the price it is worth, at the most sort of optimistic estimate. That's the part. That's where the money comes from. That's where the decarbonization money comes from. And if you're between 20 and 40, you're the generation that's going to see over the next decade about 60 to 80 trillion or more of money coming your way. How you invest that money is where this money for the decarbonization come from. You can give it to governments and hope governments do the job they want, or you can go along, really engage with the communities in what I would rather call the beautiful South rather than the global South. Don't go to a university in Harvard, forget about that fee because it's not worth it. Everything they teach you there is written from a time in 17th century, 18th century. The whole perspective there is about how we are the dominant ones and we will fix the world. No, there are 8 billion other people out there who are going to fix it with you. That's where you need to spend your money with, because you need a place to go to. And that's I want to throw that there as saying, what I take from what Joseph is talking about is this part where actually the choice is a popular and populist, the popular being the driver to the political side of the populist in that way, of whether you want to live on the surface of this planet in a way that thrives or not. And whatever the political system and so on, they are the thing that will happen. The US is showing it. They can't afford to sustain their government. It doesn't matter who it is. Rachel Reeves is seeing it. It doesn't matter if Nigel Farage comes in. They're going to see that along. And then you're going to have this massive political collapse. There's going to be a vacuum. So what's going to take over that vacuum along? Is it going to be people actually coming forward and saying, you know what, we individually, and by being individually, we become collectively that political force. And it's a multicolored force. It has everything along, because in order to face an unprecedented challenge that we have, all ideas are going to come, because each idea is going to have a point where it's relevant, and it's going to come along together because it's all focused on one value, and that value is, I want to live on the surface of my planet because it's lovely there.
Yeah. All right, I just want to acknowledge a couple of our people who've been commenting. So first of all is Deborah Fawkes, who's basically saying, as a LGBTQI plus person who also has a trans relative, doesn't want to put any energy into any movement that doesn't, really recognize their fundamental human rights. I'm totally 100% with you. If we don't, environmental justice, human rights, it's all part of the same story that we need to recognize. Pete Burge is saying addressing climate change shouldn't be seen as an existential or ideological challenge to be overcome, even if it is. Rather, it should be seen as a solution to anemic economic growth. I don't know, Pete. And then the last one is the nation state is not the be all and end all. There is a huge potential for local climate. And we've talked about this before, Deborah, and 100% agree with you. Currencies at the city level, decoupled from the global economy. And the other thing that I'm not hearing spoken about is the humans are about to be taken out of work in a massive way. And then there's going to be these companies that basically have no human capital and no obligations to humans. So are we just going to allow them to become multi-trillion-dollar companies, or do they have an obligation to fund, the transition, universal basic income, those sort of things? Joseph?
Absolutely. So first of all, you're right. The labour market is going to be breathtakingly different in an eye-wateringly short period of time. Right?
Yeah.
For many reasons, and you know, it's kind of a bit of a cliche to say that, but I don't think people have really understood what that implies. Not many people have, the regular person at least. So first of all, you know, I think this is where taking power and not, you know, lobbying for change makes all the difference. So ultimately, those companies, we're going to be paying everyone. There will be some kind, let's call it for argument's sake, a carbon-backed universal basic income of some description that is going to be necessary to both offset all of the impacts of AI and automation, as well as helping people with the cost of decarbonisation. We're going to be paying people some kind of universal basic income for sure. It might not be called that, but something with a similar net effect. Secondly, a lot of those companies are not going to exist in the new order, I would argue. So first of all, let's think about climate populism not as the long-term solution, rather the emergency brake. Because one of the criticisms that I often get around climate populism, and it's a very valid one, is that it's just a band-aid solution. It's not really addressing the long-term systemic changes that we need to make. And that is actually 100% true. But my counter to that is that, you know, we don't have time for a multi-generation project of changing human consciousness and global systems right now. If we kind of try and figure out how to do it and implement it all in one go, we're going to run off the edge of the cliff. So I see climate populism as a way of using the current structure of, you know, macroeconomics, geopolitics, the electoral system as an emergency brake, just to give us a breather in order to implement those longer term systemic solutions. So if we take power, then we can start doing interesting things. So ultimately, I mean, obviously there are many, many reasons why this sounds nuts, but all of the solutions that are going to come are going to look nuts by today's standards. Those businesses are going to go, they're going to be made illegal. There will be no polluting businesses ultimately. We'll just put them out. And obviously there's a very complex transitional argument around how that happens, but it will be one that needs to be distilled into a very simple fashion for most folks. And the way that I would see that is because ultimately, as I said, climate populism is an embracing movement. And here I might just go back to that earlier comment about LGBTQI people, right? It is absolutely a human rights, social justice movement. There are only two groups of people under climate populism: the polluters, who represent death, and the rest of us who represent life. That's it. That's the ultimate distillation of the groups of people. Now, there's going to be a lot of, you know, that the rest of us is very heterogeneous and diverse. But ultimately, those are the two groups of people. Nobody, apart from the polluters, are getting shut down in climate populism. But let's make it clear, the polluters are getting shut down. They're going out of business. But because climate populism is ultimately an embracing movement, which I think has to also have a redemptive arc, the kind of narrative that I would probably spin is, all right, we get into power. Let's say that we spent the next 10 years figuring out some cunning transition plan. We implement it, flood the zone in exactly the way that Trump is doing right now, with this absolute tsunami of policies that radically transform the domain in a short period of time. And essentially, you're going to give polluters two choices. You can either get with the program and figure out how you're going to reorient your business in order to enable this new course correction of climate change. And let's say we're going to be very generous about it. We're going to give you, I don't know, whatever it is, 5 years to do it. And when you do it, all of your past sins are going to be forgiven. And in fact, we'll even celebrate you. We'll sing songs about you for the next 1,000 years about how you were part of the transition into this new part of human civilization. That's because we're merciful and believe in the power of change. On the other hand, if you don't do that, you will be punished with immediate and ruthless effect. You will go to prison for the rest of your life. There will be nothing else for you. It's a very clear choice. You can be with life or you can be with death. And we will let all of the past be gone, but we're going to be shutting your businesses down. It's gone. And so a lot of the problems that we see today will be resolved in that transition period. I don't know how long the transition period is. I don't know the technicalities of it. We can figure that out.
All right. So, like, thinking about all the implications of what he's just said, Richard or David, do one of you want to jump in? I'm thinking also there's lots of aspects to this bit.
Let Richard go in, otherwise I won't stop.
All right, Richard.
No, I mean it's certainly, in my mind, it is part of the radical rethinking we need, right? I come from the natural position, which is I'm very skeptical of political movements, because I've never ever seen politics really generate anything substantial. It's all cosmetics. And it's possible that the climate crisis we're facing will be the kind of shock to people that actually galvanizes real political change around the world. I think you first need to go through that process where you need to break it before you can fix it. And I think the climate will do that for us. It will break it before we can start fixing it again. My natural position is always the one of essentially, the financial guy, the trader. I can always trade myself out of any bad position because I have enormous belief in my own ability to navigate the environment. And what you come to the conclusion, if you have that natural position I have, is that the climate will probably be bigger than you. In all likelihood, that's the case. So how do you go about giving me the ground where I can thrive, where I can actually continue to make money and I can continue to have a good lifestyle? Then we need to attack this, and it needs to change. But my inclination is that we will first break down everything there is before we start fixing it. And I'm not entirely sure how that will happen. It's changing on a daily basis almost. David is more in the coming off the cliff kind of belief that because the system is so leveraged at every level, any major disruption like COVID will just collapse it. While I'm more inclined to think you will get like 5 to 10 years that are really, really miserable from here for everyone. And that eventually will be the catalyst for dramatic change. Because I truly think that the economic environment that we're facing now, at the very macro level, is the worst, certainly that I have ever seen in my working career. And I'm a pretty old guy, so you're talking 35 years. This is by far the worst environment we've ever seen ahead of us. But going back as a fairly, ardent student of history and economic history, I cannot really see a modern parallel where we are this, knee deep into shite, basically. The 1930s is the obvious parallel, but that came as a falling off a cliff because we had overvaluation and overextension and too much leverage in economic systems. And then you got tremendous political drift that ended very, very badly. But I still think this is different, and it is at a bigger macro level than anything the 30s threw at us. But I really, really do think that you need to break it all down before you can build it up.
Can I just quickly jump in? I just sort of I can't see who it says, but by the time we get a universal shock, won't it be too late? So on the environmental front, have we gone too far? Is it too late? That's always the consideration. But I don't know. I kind of feel like Trump and Musk and all of these dudes, they are the universal shock that potentially could wake the world up. So that's, to me, is the opportunity here. Joseph, you were talking about Farage and his party Reform winning the next UK election, which just horrifies me. You know, you guys started this nonsense with Brexit, right? And then the US followed up with the first election of Trump. It's like, come on, guys, let's wake up. I want to encourage you. I'll put it in the weekend reads. Simon Holmes a Court, a very wealthy Australian, basically really sort of got behind the independent movement in Australia, and they're putting 36 candidates forward at the next Australian election, and that's going to break the two-party system. And they've been very, very successful. So there are other options out there. We don't have to go to the extreme. There's other ones. That was my only point. But Joseph, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to go off on a little bit of a tangent, because as I was, I've had the luxury of giving my little rant, and Richard had the luxury of countering that with his less ranty, but personal opinion. Here's a problem that I see, and again, working on the assumption that we're largely progressive people, both speaking and listening, is that one of the main problems that I see right now in terms of how to operationalize this type of conversation is that, progressives are, albeit pseudo-intellectual group of people who like to talk. They like to deconstruct. They like to find problems with other people's ways forward. And then what you get is this kind of, number one, a kind of, analysis paralysis, where everyone just sits there finding problems with proposals. Number two, you get a kind of People's Front of Judea situation, where a whole group of people with ultimately the same mission end up refusing to talk to one another because of these tiny minutiae of strategic difference. And what it ends up is a bunch of people doing absolutely nothing. And this is really a characteristic of the left for the past, 100 years or so. With some exceptions, of course. I'm being dramatic. Give me a bit of license on that one. But this is actually a fundamental problem, because the other side, they don't have this problem. They come up with ideas, they roll with them, they mobilise money, influence, and power around those ideas, and they just make stuff happen. So the challenge,
and they're long term.
They're long term. Yeah. I mean, if you haven't already, I'd recommend reading Jane Meyer's book Dark Money. The radical rise of how the billionaires create the radical right, or the subtitle, something like that, which does a really good job of showing that we've had about half a century of systematic construction of support networks for these ideas that are really kind of manifesting now in some ways. So what we need to do is to avoid, obviously we need analysis, we need deconstruction, we need rational thought, of course. And we need a proper plan, but we can't get stuck in this problem of constantly poking holes and refusing to actually take stuff, because the reality is that something like climate populism is coming. That there's no discussion about that. The discussion about is what form does it take?
Yeah.
So you can either have the kind of climate populism that I'm talking about, which is very similar to David's kind of words. I mean, the phrase that I always use is in service to life on Earth. Or you have a bunch of bad guys doing it. And that's going to be horrific. But unfortunately, they're the ones who tend to actually take action. So it's really important that progressives actually start doing stuff rather than deconstructing, whinging, succumbing to Trump deranged syndrome, being shrill, thinking that tweeting about stuff and even going on demonstrations is of any significance, which it's not ultimately. And really kind of take ownership about what is required to actually take power. And we're just not very good at it. Despite the fact that we have right on our side. We've got, the continuation of human civilization and life on Earth on our side, moral good. Everything's on our side, but the other guys just actually, they plan better. They're more strategic. They take action. They do stuff. And we've really got to fix that, because the clock is ticking.
Yeah. I want to jump in there because I had a thought and I forgot it. So I could see a space for a Lee Kuan Yew type person to sort of, the benevolent dictator type, to just come out and shake us and get us all together and get us moving forward. So I could see an argument. It will never sit, especially in Western, currently democratic, potentially moving towards the authoritarian bent. But the other thing, of course, is if you've looked at the movements behind Trump, because everyone's focused on Trump, and it's the people behind Trump. We've talked about this before, but when I look at the city of Praxis and those sort of things, the Yavin and Musk and Peter Thiel and all those sort of things. When I look at that, and I've been trying to work out I understand what they're trying to do. It's almost like a mega bunker, right, for the types of people that they want. I think they might be a little bit behind in their timeline, but I think what we need to do is, because this is all very public information, it's not a conspiracy theory. People don't want to talk about it. More people are talking about it. I think they are acting, but I think they're acting for a very small group of people that they want to bring together to put in these cities. And then when it gets too hot and the extreme weather events, and Greenland's obviously the place potentially for Praxis. If you wipe out enough of the rest of humanity, you can regenerate the earth and move on with humanity. And I think that's how they're thinking. When you look between the lines of what they're actually publicly saying. But when it's like no one wants to talk about that because it sounds too crazy, but it's not crazy. That's what they're doing. And then you've got the Christian nationalists, obviously, who are going for the end of times and hoping for Jesus to come back. They're a huge force in America right now. Big force. And they want the end of times. I don't think anyone who believes in the end of times should go anywhere near politics, because or the defense industry or anything like that, because they have an ability to push it forward. And then, of course, you've got the Project 2025 people who've got this other sort of dimension, but they're all overlapping. But I think we've got to understand, and it's not Trump. He's just at the front.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other issue there, and I don't end up coming into like a progressive bashing situation, but I do find progressive people very tedious, which is quite painful given that I am one. Is that they've got a very limited range of thinking. They have, and it's I was about to call it rational, but it's not even that. It's a particular part of the spectrum of rationality, because the type of stuff that you're talking about is also rational, but it falls outside of it. So yeah, there are many interesting conversations, but they're kind of quite credible. I mean, why does Elon Musk, who just a decade ago was interested in pushing EVs and solar power, suddenly kind of taking the stance that he does? Why does Peter Thiel, who is incredibly clever, hold the batshit crazy opinions that he does on climate? It doesn't make sense. There's obviously something else going on in the mix. My assumption, and I've said this before, is that I believe that Musk and Thiel, knowing what they know about business, which is a lot, they don't know much about politics, but they do know a lot about business, is that they've looked at the business model behind what people commonly describe as net zero. They've decided that it is obviously totally implausible and going to be a complete failure. So why bother with it? My assumption is that they've assuming that we're going to find some kind of technological solution to this along the way, and that while other people, not that they are, but while they're ostensibly crippling themselves in order to implement net zero, they're just going to say, balls to that, we're just going to run off the edge of the cliff, we'll invent a parachute before we hit the ground, and we'll take both the short-term and the medium and long-term gains. Whether or not that's a conversation that they're actually having explicitly with Trump, or whether or not they're just playing him for a useful idiot, I don't know. But certainly,
he's going to be dead. I mean, he's going to be dead. That's why people are so obsessed with him. But he's going to be dead. They're talking about him going through a second term. Maybe he'll be alive. Maybe he won't. He's not important.
The point being is that the type of point that you made and the kind of point that I've just made are typically denounced as conspiracy thinking by progressives, because they have this kind of weird, it's like a sensibility or a taste, an aesthetic that's quite limited, and they feel that any types of any proposals that fall outside of it are somehow gauche or nutty, and they other them as not us, right? And this is another reason why they lose, because when you look at the rest of society, they don't share those sensibilities. Either they've actually got a more expansive way of thinking that allows for that, or they just enjoy it as entertainment. They like the vibe. Right?
Yeah.
So and this is where it comes back into vibe. So climate populism has really got, you could be cynical about this and say it's performative. It doesn't really matter. It's actually got to play to that type of vibe that not just accommodates that type of conspiratorial thinking, but mobilizes it. And here we get the problem of, okay, so who's going to do that, right? No, none of our current progressive leaders want to do that because they don't want to be the next Joe Rogan, right? And this is actually really, of course, why everybody pushes back against the likes of Joe Rogan, not so much because of the ideas that he has, but the success that he has in mobilizing that kind of energy, and they're jealous of it, right? But you've got to step out. You've got to step out of your comfort zone, and that's one of the reasons why, again, we lose constantly, because progressives are actually more interested in preserving their position in the progressive status quo. They don't want to risk it. So they won't do what is necessary to affect genuine change, which is actually horrific. So there are many quite easy things we could fix.
I interpret that as they have no shame. We have too much of it, right?
Well, I think there's something else. I mean, I have a physics background, right? I spent a decade working in physics. I was before I moved over into the dark side and worked in finance. I had a research group in Oxford. I was a university lecturer there. And before that, I had this fellowship where I was able to do whatever I want, one of those kind of things. So I have this kind of physics background along with it. And one of the things that we talk about, that Richard and I increasingly, is this aspect, what we call emergent change, emergent economics. And emergence is really key. Emergence arises out of constraints. It's the way in which a natural system suddenly finds a path to a completely different state. And it does that because there are constraints, because it's unresolvable. That's how you get emergence happening. If it can be resolved, it's still like pouring liquid on the surface of a table. It just runs off. There's no need for anything to happen. There's no need for the liquid to take any shape. But if you force it, then different things happen. If you squeeze, just put a boundary on it, it takes the shape of that. But if you start squeezing the liquid, then all kinds of other properties start coming about. And that's what's happening. That's what climate change itself is going to be, that massive constraint. One of the aspects about the different types of kind of transitions you have is what's called continuous kind of transitions. And falling in love, for me, is like that. Two people, they may go out, suddenly, whoa, something's happened. Brains forming completely differently. There's a mutual connection that forms. What's needed for that sort of emergence is transparency. Is what, or maybe transparency is not the right word. Is that sort of what Joseph's talking about in that sense? Is that communications around? Is going beyond trying to say, I want to direct it in this way. That's how we learn classical mechanics. So as a physicist, you start by learning classical mechanics, which is, Newton's laws, force equals, kind of acceleration or action, reaction, and those sort of things. And that's the language we have about our politics and all of those things. So when Joseph talks about the progressives and things, they're thinking in that very classical way. If I push here, that happens there. I can think through all the complexity and that works. But our scientific and mathematical understanding develop different things. So Gödel's theorem is fundamental. It's this idea that actually complex enough, it can never be self-consistent. Whoa. I have a mathematics that says that my mathematics can never be consistent if it's complex enough. The real world is complex. It's not about it being consistent. Then you have this part about transitions and emergence that comes about. Squeeze it hard enough, things differ, amazing things happen. But what it needs to make that happen is the communications, is the engagement along. That's where the populism is going to find its strongest strength and ability to come about. that communication along. I don't have to agree with you, but if I'm communicating with you, something happens out of that. The difference between that and Trump and those kind of sides is I have to determine it. We have to agree. If not, I do that. But it's the communication itself. That's what I love about what Joseph's doing, because he's saying, let's talk about this. Let's actually get going around it, because under the constraints, something will pop up.
All right. We're going to wrap up in a minute. Just let me, I don't know what I just done there to my, did you, does that look different for you too?
Can I just to finish off on that, it's just basically to say, if you don't meet with each other, you never fall in love.
Yeah, good one. All right. So I love the essential message that Joseph has given us, which is we have to take power. Right. I think that's so, it's so simple and it's so key. And if anyone takes anything away from this, we have to take power. So whether it's you, it's someone you know, wherever you are, take power. So I think that's a really, really great message. So one of the things that I've been doing lately, and this might sound a bit weird to people, but I like to put myself in people's shoes. It's my empathy sort of qualities, right? So I keep asking myself, if I was a narcissistic sociopath with world power and was the richest person on earth, and I was looking at the situation the world was in, what would I do? And I'm trying to interpret it based on what is being done, right? And so my conclusions are, well, I'd look at the situation and I'd hear the scientists saying the max for humans based on how we live is about 1 billion people. So we've got to wipe out 7 billion people. All right. So that's the first job. So to wipe out 7 billion and maybe keep, but you don't want to keep 1 billion because you want to leave a bit of growth there for birth and stuff. But you'd need to build a certain amount of places where people could live and prosper and, have children and be the next generation. Obviously, your own progeny would be in the mix. That's what I would do if I was a narcissistic, sociopathic billionaire with all the power in the world, as Elon Musk has right now, and in this very unique situation where just because Trump was elected, they could do this. And I think that they're doing it. And I think it's obvious they're doing it. And I don't think they care about the rest of us. But I don't think that's the only possible path. Because if you're not a narcissistic sociopath, even if you don't have all the power in the world, there is another path that we can take, that is where we can take care of the most people that we possibly can. Not everyone's going to survive. The environmental crisis is going to get worse. We need to prepare for that. We need to prepare emotionally for that. But I think there is a part. So, but I think the point is we've got to claim power, and we've got to do it in a way that's never been done before. So I'm going to hand it back to Joseph and just wrap it up, because I know you've got to get off.
Yeah, listen, you're right. I mean, there are many ways forward. I mean, I'm talking about climate populism. I think it's probably the best way forward and the most inevitable way forward, but it's not necessarily the only way forward. Yeah. So I don't want people to think that I'm kind of shutting down other ideas. The issue that I would like people to think about is that, just to come back to this idea of you've got to stop thinking and talking about it and actually start doing stuff. And that comes with really uncomfortable compromises. It comes with uncomfortable compromises with your allies in terms of what, the operations actually looks like. That's hard enough, but unfortunately it gets a whole lot harder, because let me tell you, when you actually start going and have conversations with the other side, by God, that brings a whole different level of internal conflict. And you're going to have to figure that out, how to navigate that, because the only way this is going to work is if we work together with the people who currently we probably think of as enemies. Because remember, there are only two groups: the polluters who drive death and the rest of us who drive life. So we've got to figure out how to make that work. So, go and find your own ways of thinking about it, for sure. I'm trying to operationalize climate populism. I have a plan in mind that actually shifts. Not that the thinking is over. The thinking and the talking is never over. It's an ongoing process. But trying to move from that kind of getting stuck in the thinking trap into the doing. So I'm working on a plan for that. I've got conversations that I'm going on with people. I invite everybody to go and, connect with me on LinkedIn, drop me a message. I'm happy to include you in those conversations. But there will be other people doing it as different things. But just make sure you're actually doing action with a theory of change that is honest. Because, building awareness is not an honest theory of change, because we've been aware of climate change for decades. You've actually got to have a theory of change that works, and that's really sticky. But it's all about action. But come and have a conversation with me, and I'll happily bring you into my conversations about action for sure.
And action also, that's where you get your hope from.
Yes, that's a really good point. I feel fantastic. That climate populism to me has been an emotional gift, because it's really, while many of its implications are wild, it's the only honest theory of change that I've been able to settle on, which could actually work. And that has actually given me a whole different level of energy and motivation that I was missing for quite some time, and for which I'm grateful.
I would like to add, if I may, one thing to that in sort of that action, and that's the part that Richard and I have spent the past few years trying to figure out in that sense, is that action is how you get paid. So you got to live, but for it to be consistent in the end, you have to be able to you have to live off what you do. So you have to take action, but that action has to be able to pay you to live, because otherwise that action is part of your charity to something else. And at the end of the day, when the world gets tougher, charity disappears. So you have to make it into the way that you are going to be able to get paid, because that way, if you can do that, everyone else can do it.
That's important. I've just looked up Papa Power. I can't see who's Papa Power by Dead Man's Bones apparently is my theme song, so I've already got it up on Spotify. I'll have a listen. All right, look, we're going to let you go, Joseph. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think that moment when you have the epiphany, I had a different epiphany, because I followed the doomers for a long time, not because I was a doomer, but because I wanted to find an answer that wasn't doom, and I did. And it was basically a belief in the human spirit that we can come together and do this, and that's where I sort of started from in my moving forward with hope. So yeah, I appreciate the moment where climate populism spoke to you. But thank you so much for joining us. And I think so. The big takeaways, quick ones, like power. And then you just said something before that's just gone out of my head, but I thought it was really good as well. But David, Richard, a couple of sentences, takeaways.
I'm very grateful for Joseph taking the time to be with us today. It's probably a little bit more powerful discussion in many sense, and that we normally have, and I think that's good. We brought a lot of interesting issues to the fore, and while I think we all generally agree about the underlying causes, we see kind of different aspects and different strains, and I think that's really good, because only by educating ourselves will we find the next steps that are necessary to take in this march forward.
I want to say, with this action part, play the ball. The ball's been passed to you, play it. Don't just go and stare at it, play it.
Yeah. And talking about it to your family and your friends and your community, and normalizing the conversation is a big part of playing the ball. All right, guys, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. All right, bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.